4.1 by Marc Kenneally. Health and safety and ethical and legal issues. Any testing that takes place needs to be ethical, legal, and have health and safety in place. Ethics are the moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity. It's what's right and what's wrong. If something is legal, it needs to be within the boundaries of civil law. Health and safety is the regulations and procedures in place to prevent accident or injury in workplaces or public environments. Nazis and Nuremberg Code. Prior to 1947, there was no accepted code of conduct for human experimentation. However, the Nazis performed so many tests on human subjects during the war and killed numerous people through testing the human's body's capabilities. Due to this, the Nuremberg Code was created. It consisted of 10 points which researchers and other people carrying out tests need to obey by. So here's a picture of the Nuremberg Code, and that's 10 points. And the Declaration of Helsinki. In 1964, the WMA, which is the World Medical Association, created the Declaration of Helsinki. This is a statement of ethical principles regarding human experimentation. So the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code established that voluntary consent is essential. Studies should be based on good science. Benefits of the test should outweigh the risks, and participants should be able to withdraw. The experiment should be carried out by a scientifically qualified person, and research protocols should be reviewed by an independent committee. BASES. BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. BASES produce a code of conduct for sport practitioners and researchers, and it outlines legal issues and health and safety guidelines. BASES was set up for sport and exercise experiments that will take place in the future, as it provides a code for the researchers to follow. Scenario 1. A recent sports science graduate wants to carry out their first test on aspiring male and female gymnasts. He's organised a half day involving and skin fold caliper, which looks at body fat of the test subjects. So here's scenario 1. So, although the researcher did get informed consent of the participants, it was signed by their parents, as the participants were too young, as they were under 18, to sign on their own and needed someone to sign for them. However, it hasn't been informed that the participants' parents were told of the protocols as to what would happen during the test, and therefore we wouldn't know what the participants would experience. Because of this, the consent becomes invalid. The consent form would also have to contain a subject disclaimer, which is whether it is okay for the participants to take part despite them knowing the consequences of the test. As the researcher hid the protocols from the participants, it would mean that the researcher has deceived the parents via omission. This is where the researcher withholds information from the participants. They would also have to fully debrief the participants after the tests, so that they are fully aware as to the purpose of the tests. Before the testing phase, the researcher said they needed to get changed to save time. However, the participants didn't feel comfortable getting changed in front of each other, as the test was for both boys and girls. The researcher should have taken this into account and respect the decision of the participants. However, they didn't, and as a result, the participant may have felt nervous or uncomfortable, which could result in psychological harm to the participant. At the end of the test, it says the researcher put the results of everyone on the whiteboard for everyone to see. This is breaching the Data Protection Act, as it isn't keeping the data anonymous and isn't keeping the confidentiality of the results. And as a result of this, the researcher is abusing the trust of the participant, and this could possibly result in psychological harm to the participant, which could possibly reduce their confidence. However, it would also have a negative effect on the researcher, as they could lose their job, they could experience a suspension, they may require ethical training, or they might have guilt about the actions and the effect it has on the performer. Ethical training is where they have to be trained again and made sure that they know the ethics, the ethical sides of things again. So, as mentioned within scenario 1, a consent form must be completed by everyone taking part in the test. Here's an example of a consent form used with a different type of testing. It includes protocols explaining what will happen within the test. So here's scenario 2. The researcher unsuccessfully carried out the testing as they didn't take into account a lot of factors and also broke a lot of the rules about scientific testing. The researcher didn't take into account health and safety when carrying out the testing of the participants. The HSE, which is the Health and Safety Executive, is the health. Suggests that risk assessment should be carried out before testing. This wasn't done in the scenario by the researcher, and they are therefore putting themselves and the participant at risk both psychologically and physically. A risk assessment should be carried out by the researcher. In the risk assessment, it should identify the possible hazards, state who is at risk, evaluate the likelihood and severity of the hazards, and also state how it would be avoided. Another thing which the researcher didn't do was have the correct laboratory safety procedures. When the boy falls off the treadmill and hurts his knee, there should have been a safety mat behind the treadmill, and he should have had a cord going around him which attaches to the machine. So when he falls back, it would stop the machine and stop the treadmill from turning if the cord came loose. This way the treadmill would have stopped after the boy fell, and the mat would protect the boy as he fell, and he wouldn't hurt his knee. The first aid procedure was also wrong in this situation, as the boy hurt his knee, and the researcher said to run it under a tap. He didn't go with the participant to make sure they're okay and make sure they reach the tap. So they might not have actually been able to get there, but the researcher wouldn't know, as they didn't go with them and just left him to go on his own. The researcher should have used a first aid kit and should be trained to deal with the situation instead of saying just run it under some water, as it's very vague and they might not know what's wrong with the participant. The researcher should have known where the nearest first aid kit was, and should also know where the nearest first aid trained person was. However, none of this happened, so the researcher violated the first aid procedure. Something else the researcher did wrong was they didn't prepare the participant, as they reduced the time spent warming up. This would result in incorrect warm-up, and the participants are then more vulnerable to injuries, as they wouldn't be prepared for the exercise. The researcher didn't respect the participant's right to withdraw. This happened when the participant put their thumb down to show discomfort and wanted to stop. However, the researcher didn't allow them to stop, which was therefore not respecting them and respecting their right to withdraw. The researcher then selected the people they wanted based on the strongest boy athletes. This goes against equality and impartiality. They should have chosen some girls and not chosen the best athletes, as this would make the data look better, and so the results wouldn't be fair just because they chose the best athletes. This is scientific misconduct, as the data would benefit from having the stronger athletes being used instead of the weaker ones. So they are misconducting the experiment, and it's also the researcher's responsibility to not be to have an equal test and a fair test, and not be biased in the results. When one of the participants fell off the treadmill and hurt their leg, they experienced physical harm. As a result of this, the researcher could have a temporary suspension, they could have their contract terminated, or they could have their BASES accreditation terminated. Due to the severity of the leg injury, they could also experience criminal law tribunal, which could be either a fine or they could get sent to prison. Finally, the researcher didn't take into account the test sequence, so this is the order in which the tests are carried out. This wasn't done as the participants were made to do the test straight after scenario 1, and the researcher should have given the participants time to warm up and also to recover from the test from scenario 1. As mentioned in scenario 2, the researcher must fill out a risk assessment which identifies the likelihood and severity of risks that could take place within the test. Here's an example of a risk assessment. So scenario 3. In scenario 3, they carried out the same tests which with volunteers. The volunteers took a medical questionnaire, and half of them have asthma and other medical conditions. So the testing is done to see the difference a medical condition has on everyday sport and exercise. The researcher gets hungry, and so he leaves the testing to get some food. When the researcher has left the room, one of the participants suffers from an asthma attack, and the researcher comes back midway through the attack and is able to get their inhaler and help them. However, the testing is then continued after the participant's attack. So something which the researcher did correctly is they made the participants carry out the test. This gave the health screening test. So this gave the researcher information about the participants, such as medical history and emergency contacts. This information is needed in case of emergency, so they're able to get them to the correct medicine. Something else that the researcher did well was they used volunteers only, so they weren't making anyone do anything that they were uncomfortable with. The researcher walked out halfway through the test, and so the participants weren't safe, as the first aid procedure wasn't carried out correctly, as the participants were being watched, and therefore medicines and other first aid needed can't be applied or supplied. The participants could also be doing the test wrong, or could not be trying their hardest, meaning the results would be wrong if it's a maximal effort test, and this would be scientific misconduct. After the participant suffered from the attack, the researcher tried to carry on the test, which wouldn't be allowed. The researcher would be forced to terminate the test, as their bases, accreditation and other validation would be removed, and the researcher would also be looking at facing legal punishment for leaving the participants unsupervised. Another punishment that could be given is that the researcher could have to be supervised if they want to work again. This would involve them having to be supervised at all times when carrying out tests. During scenario 3, physical harm was experienced by the participant as they had an asthma attack. Psychologically, participants could have also been harmed, as they might have been scarred by witnessing the attack. As a result of this, the researcher would have to go through ethical training, and would also probably receive a suspension, termination of contract, could be fined or sent to prison. Ethical training is done in a situation to get the researcher to be able to identify and deal with any ethical problems that may come up in the future. The researcher would have to be ethically cleared before being able to do any more testing in the future if they didn't experience any punishment and still wish to test. A committee would have to ethically clear the participant. The researcher would either would have to explain why they want to do the testing, and the committee would either grant them ethical clearance, participate to minor amendments, grant ethical clearance, participate to major amendments, or not grant any ethical clearance. So the committee would have to think about how the testing would benefit anything, and then they would also have to consider the risk-benefit analysis, which is where the committee review the benefits and the risks of the test. In order for the test to take place, the benefits would have to outweigh the risks. So, as mentioned in scenario 3, the participants must take a PAR-Q test, which will help the researcher know if they have any medical conditions they should know about. This is an example of a PAR-Q test. So we got medical history, we got diet, exercise, and mental health questions.